So good evening to the Caron Chapel YouTube audience, and also again to the Board of Trustees and the patient community and anyone watching on the live stream, especially those of you who are cooped up. It's nice to have you here with us in this way. I'm moved by a piece of music that the YouTube folks didn't get to experience, and what occurs to me is I have a subject for this evening, which is vulnerability. And I happen to also be a musician, and I know that when I share music with people who listen, especially in an audience of this size and in this kind of context, it's an act of vulnerability. So I want to thank you very much for taking that risk. And those who will also share later tonight with more music, it's one of the instances in which I feel the most raw. And I only just for this particular service have added the topic of vulnerability. We have a rotation of topics for the chapel messages, as many of you are regulars know. And but I'm excited about this topic, and I've inserted it in future rotations. So I think this has a place in our conversation. And a number of years ago, sometime around 2010, I was directed to watch a TED talk by a woman named Brene Brown. Suspect many of you will have heard of her, but this gives you an insight into what a snarky, arrogant jerk I can be. I was like, I don't need more education on shame because I grew up in the era of John Bradshaw. So those of you who are old enough to know John Bradshaw, I thought I was an expert in shame. And so I approached her YouTube talk with a great deal of skepticism and some cynicism and my own arrogance. And I will confess I was really quite moved by it. And since 2010, that TED Talk in the first year got 8 million views. So she's a kind of a nerdy researcher who would have preferred actually to just like throw that out there and probably stay behind the curtain. At least she alleges that, although she's done a good job of being a spotlight person. And I'll take it at face value that it does make her uncomfortable. I'm sure it does, and I think many people in the limelight have this weird struggle with the intense exposure that they dare. But to her credit, one of the things I will say is since 2010 to I think her most recent text is Dare to Lead, she's continued to refine and hone her work. She's developing the concept of her understanding of shame, and she's paired it with vulnerability, which I think is a helpful insight. I think it ups the Bradshaw game. And shame has always been a Caron topic. This has been a place where, when I first arrived here, and I was directed by the great Father Bill Hellberg to think about shame as a key piece of the puzzle. One of the phrases we often encourage people to think about is leaving shame on the mountain. And the magic of Magic Mountain was partly in this very thing, that people would experience a profound amount of shame reduction in their experiences here. And so I see some heads nodding among our trustees, and I hope there would be heads nodding for those, especially like Brian, who's getting ready to discharge. I hope that there is this thing, because I think we come in to this kind of a setting with our heads bowed low, and stigma and scorn and all this stuff. So I'm going to borrow some material from, I will say, the great Brene Brown. And because I think she formulates what vulnerability is in concise ways that rival Father Bill for his pithy stuff. So, and maybe she's a little more verbose, but what I've come to understand from trying to really enter into her conversation with the popular culture about shame and vulnerability is that she understands vulnerability as involving uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. So these are the beginning criteria of getting vulnerable. It's in order, like, whoa, it doesn't sound really appealing, right? Uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. If it makes you have a little bit of heebie-jeebies, then we're headed in actually the correct direction. Because vulnerability isn't fun necessarily. It isn't easy. It certainly isn't easy, but I think also for people who suffer from use disorders, it's especially not easy, because I think we're practiced at intimacy with our substance or behavior of concern. So I think we would much rather cozy up for me to Johnny Walker Red. I'm in long-term recovery, and that's the substance I still remember as my go-to. There were a lot of them, I would say, garbage head, but if I were to talk about having a craving, it would be for a cigarette or Johnny Walker or both. And I think that when I would feel vulnerable, that would trigger a craving. And I think that I used drunkenness to avoid vulnerability. Or in drunkenness, I would have this disinhibited exhibitionism, like oversharing and maudlin and wake up the next morning and have the, oh my God, what did I do? And it wasn't the person who was like, who am I sleeping with? But there are those in the room, don't raise your hands, who've had that experience. And alcoholism generalized to the phenomenon of addiction, and today we generalize it to shopping and compulsive gambling and sex and relationship disorders and all these other forms of internet gaming, are linked to the subject matter in that way. That I think because being a human being involves such vulnerability that we crave relief from weirdly being seen, and that this is the lure of the material that causes you to have a wristband and be a patient here, is that it in some ways alleviated this existential problem that I think we have as human beings. And often those of us who are here have stories about exactly what drives the insecurity and the difficulty with letting ourselves be seen. So that could be trauma, secrets that we don't want to tell, issues of our personal identity, cultural dislocation. There's so many adverse child experiences as the category of the kinds of things that pop up later in adult life as an addictive disorder that are the struggles of our particular existence, and that set us up to end up on this seemingly awful ride. But here's the paradox, and this is what I wanted to make sure I said tonight, is that as risky as vulnerability seems, in sobriety, it's the coin of the realm. It's the way healing happens, is through the honest uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Another phrase that Brene Brown uses is a raw, honest bid for connection. That's a really good phrase. And one of the things that she distinguishes between the Jerry Springer and Facebook post mockery of vulnerability is that she suggests that when the kind of vulnerability that she sees as so fundamental to reducing shame is when we take uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure in a raw bid for connection in context of relationships with people who have earned the right to hear our stories. And in a weird way, when I walk into a 12-step environment, or you walk into Recovery Dharma, or you walk into a smart recovery meeting, or whatever you're going to use to help you stay sober, but the peer community mutual support component of your next level of care, there's a thing that you know, which is that we have all been puking in the toilet, right? Or whatever it is. Like we have experienced this misery of the difficulties of the problem of addiction. And in the common bond of our suffering, I'm going to say, you have earned the right to hear my story, and I hope I have earned the right to hear your story. Just because, like, one of the things that Marty knows, he's probably heard this 300 times, he's sick of it, but like, my third, this is a test for me, this is always a test. I tell you, my third DUI, I went home and said, that's it, no more driving at night. And the people who laugh are the people who have earned the right to hear my story. And the people that don't laugh, I've told that in rooms where there's dead silence, and people look at me, and I'm like, well, then you're not my people. And I risked vulnerability only to find out that I don't want to go any further because you're sort of not safe. And what I don't have enough time to do much more, I need to move it aside because we're going to try and be crisp with time tonight. But there's going to be an opportunity for patients to share. And this was an essential part of my sickness, was the loneliness and isolation and shame behind the Johnny Walker in which I hid. And there are people like Father Bill and my sponsors, Tom and Jean, the two sponsors that have changed my life. Jean is my sponsor of 23 years, and we still talk every Sunday. I have no secrets from that man. I believe he has no secrets from me. I've learned to be in a relationship where I risk uncertainty and emotional exposure in a relationship that is a raw bid for connection every day. I'm in that game with my wife every day, trying to be in vulnerability with her and she with me. And we know when we're not, when we're a little off course. And that's a gift of my sobriety, and it is there for you. And I really, like, when I come to this place, one of the reasons I love my job, I love this place, and I believe its essential magic is in this very thing. And if you are in this audience tonight and you are hiding behind some secret and some scorn and afraid that you can't let people hear the truth about who you are, I would share with you that you are choosing an imprisonment for a pretense of safety. And that there isn't probably a safer place than this kind of environment in which to test my hypothesis, risk coming out of your turtle shell, and find out that you can be loved as who and how you are.